All right, we're going to talk about the importance of genetic diversity today. And so, what I need for you to have is we're going to talk about the importance of genetic diversity today. All right, genetic diversity, let's start with what is it? Obviously, all living things have DNA, we all have genes, right? And so, we all have DNA, but depending on the species, it's going to vary, and those genes are going to vary. Okay, and so let's talk about genetic diversity. We know that diversity kind of means variations or differences. And just to let you know, you are going to be copying exactly what I'm writing on my note sheet, and you are also going to highlight the same things that I'm highlighting. All right, genetic diversity is the range of different inherited traits within a species. So if a species has all these different genes and traits, then they are going to have a high amount of genetic diversity. But if you look at their traits and you look at their genes, and there's not that many differences and variations and versions, then they're going to have low genetic diversity. And some examples are genetic diversity can cause differences in the shape of bird beaks, in the flavors of tomatoes, and even in the color of your hair. Genetic diversity is really important beyond just the fact that if a species has all these different traits, it's pretty cool, right? It's also really important because it gives species a better chance of survival. Okay. When a species, let's just say something happened and a population of organisms get isolated, and there's not that many of them to really mate and breed, then you can lose genetic diversity and you can actually go extinct as a result. And so genetic diversity has a direct relationship with a species' ability to survive, to adapt and survive in an environment that is constantly changing. And so we're going to talk about a few examples and really kind of cover why genetic diversity is really important to a population. All right, so we can also kind of talk about genetic diversity as genetic variation. They're kind of the same thing. Genetic variation refers to all the different gene versions that are present in a population. So gene variations basically talk about how many different traits are there? How many different genes are there for this specific trait? Right? So if we're looking at this corn, we could talk about how many different variations of corn kernel color there are, right? Okay. So once again, when we're talking about genetic variation, a lot of times it can be caused by when a population loses a lot of individuals and there's only a few individuals that are able to mate and reproduce. And so they're all going to have very similar genes to each other. And over a long time, this decrease in genetic variation, if the population has kind of all of the same genes, this can be a problem, right? Because as the environment changes, if they all have the same genes, then they're all going to be susceptible to dying. Whereas if you have some genetic variation, you have different differences in variety, then some of them actually may be able to persist and live the environmental change. Okay, so let's talk about a couple examples. One famous example and very sad example is bananas. Bananas are actually at risk of going extinct right now. Okay, and that's because of their lack of genetic diversity. Essentially, what happened is we wanted bananas to be seedless, and believe it or not, bananas actually reproduce sexually. So they have believe it or not, we wanted bananas to be seedless. So in order to do that, we needed to have every single banana grow off of the initial parent plant right here. So this is the parent plant, this is a banana tree, and then we have to have a little banana tree sprout off of it. And these are actually, we're going to point to this and we're going to say that these are clones, meaning they're an identical copy of parent. They're genetically, we're going to actually add genetically identical. They're genetically identical to their parent. So every banana that you have genetically is a clone. They have the exact same genes. Okay. And so every single banana is genetically identical. This means that if a disease were to come through, it would affect every single banana and they all would die, right? And this has actually happened in the past. In the 50s, we actually used to have a different species of banana that was popular that people ate. They were slightly bigger than our bananas that we have today. They had a slightly stronger flavor. There was a fungal disease called Panama disease, and it almost wiped out the entire species as a whole. And we actually eat a different species of banana that luckily was immune to the fungus, but we're kind of just in a waiting game. As soon as another disease comes through, it will wipe it out completely. Let's talk about the Tasmanian tiger. Okay. And so a little bit about the Tasmanian tiger is after the first humans arriving in Australia. So the first humans that arrived in Australia about 65,000 years ago, this dog-like marsupial started to disappear as soon as humans kind of arrived. Even just 3,000 years ago, the Tasmanian tiger vanished in Australia. Okay, so a lot of them completely just disappeared in Australia, and all that was left was only, it's called an isolated population, meaning it's isolated, like it doesn't have any other way of getting out or in, and there's a very small population of them on an island. So the Tasmanian tiger used to be in Australia, but they disappeared when humans got there. And the island of Tasmania, there was a very small amount of them left. And basically, if you think about it, if there's only a small amount of them left and they're on an island, then they're kind of breeding with each other. They're kind of having a lot of inbreeding, right? And so that actually led to a really, really, really decline in diversity. And we don't exactly know what happened, but probably the ice age kind of came through. There was no genetic diversity, so they're basically all the same and they have all the same traits. And so it wiped them out. For example, if we had some variety, we might have a couple of the Tasmanian tigers that had naturally longer or thicker fur, and they could have maybe survived. But instead, they had really short fur and they didn't have any variation, and so it wiped them out. Another example, and you can read more about it, I have links in the article if you want to, is actually the Irish potato famine was caused by the lack of genetic diversity. So we had genetically identical potatoes, right? Meaning they're all clones of each other, similar to the banana. And what happened was a blight came through, right? And if we look, sorry about that, blight came through and knocked them all out. I want you to look over here. Here is what we were having. Okay, we had cloned potatoes. They're all the exact same genes. And it turned out that blight completely affected all of them, right? And so they all died, and we have none left. Okay. Instead, if we had diverse, look at all those color differences in the different traits. What we might see is that blight only affects, look, the black, two of those variations. And those two variations will die out. But after the disease, we still have some of the potatoes left. Okay. Good. You can read more about it here if you wanted to, but if we were to have planted genetically diverse, we added some genetic diversity, or we didn't just plant cloned potatoes, this would not have happened. And 1 of 8 Irish people died of starvation when this happened. And so this is really, really huge, right? Planting genetically uniform, meaning clones, crops increases the losing it all whenever the environment changes. For example, if a new pest isn't introduced or rain levels drop. So you can actually have genetic variations with potatoes where they're able to resist not having as much water as another one, but you kill that variation is gone when you clone them. Okay, so once again, we already talked about this, but this is important to talk about, just repeat, right? Genetic diversity, when they're all the same, this means that there's not a large variety in the type of genes and traits that a population has. And so really important is this phrase. This means that they have fewer opportunities to adapt when the environment changes, and the environment's constantly changing. Okay. A large way that this has happened, and this actually happened with the Florida panthers, which we're going to talk about next, when a species habitat is destroyed, or if humans kind of come in and build on a habitat, and the habitat gets broken up, then the populations become isolated. So think about like a city. If a city were to pop up where the panthers live, then it would separate them into smaller groups. And so and they can't reach each other, right? And if they can't reach each other, then they're only going to mate within the small population that they have. And that's called a fragmented populations. And that can lead to loss of genetic diversity because fewer individuals can kind of survive and remain, and fewer individuals are breeding. Right? The choice of mates is going to be limited because there's only so many of them. So you actually have some inbreeding of closely related individuals, and that can lead to lack, you have the same exact traits. So that's not good. Okay. If genetic diversity gets too low, species can actually go extinct and be lost forever, like the Tasmanian tiger, right? They're lost forever because of the lack of genetic diversity. They were isolated, there was few individuals, an ice age hit, and they immediately died. If they had some variation, they likely would have been able to withstand that. All right, cool. So one interesting example of this is the Florida panther, and we used something called genetic rescue in the 1990s to actually save the Florida panther, because of what I was kind of talking about. Very few panthers were alive because humans came in and took over all the land, and genetic diversity was extremely low. The panthers were actually really sick. However, what we did was we took a closely related panther that lived in Texas. We actually took the panthers from Texas, we moved them to Florida for them to have babies, and this increased genetic diversity because we added in some more genes into the mix so that they were able to be less sick and less susceptible to environmental change. You can actually watch a video if you want to link that there. It's really interesting. Here's a good picture talking about it. So basically in the 1980s on the map, the habitat got really shrunk down, whereas it used to be this big blue area. You see that? The blue areas where they could be, but we actually restricted them. Look how tiny we restricted them to, this little tiny area. Okay, so only a couple of them existed. The original population that existed on that big blue area was very, very diverse. It had a lot of different traits. But look, when you started inbreeding, you have a low population and you lost all those variations. And this leads to health issues. For example, we actually seen that they had some heart issues. We actually look at the tail. We actually had some kind of they were deformed. So what they did was they took some panthers from Texas, and look at how these have different variations here, different colors and different varieties. We mated them with the Florida panther, and we actually came out with some healthy kittens. And we've actually saved them so that now the population has a higher diversity, and they're actually able to survive. If you look at this nice graph, we've actually had more panthers surviving now, and they also are more diverse. So that's called genetic rescue. Okay, some key points. Okay, just to make sure we understand what's going on. Genetic diversity is the variation of genes within the population. The more variations, the more diverse they are. The less variations, the less diverse they are. Okay, when populations have low genetic variation, they are more vulnerable to changing environmental conditions, whether that be a disease, less rain, habitat loss, the whole climate change, right? Pollution. They're going to be way less likely to survive that if they're all clones of each other. They don't really have variations that will allow some of them to kind of survive and adapt. Okay, so genetic diversity is important to maintaining the health of a species. If there are fewer individuals in a population with similar genes, they're not going to be able to survive that changing environment, such as disease, pollution, and climate change. From here on out, you're going to go ahead and answer the questions below, and you will turn this in. Have a great day.